Midlife crisis, truth or myth? The factors disrupting your middle years. Divorce, children, career. Turn these challenges into meaningful rites of passage. Next on Living Smart. Hello, I'm Patricia Gras. Welcome to Living Smart, a new series on how to get the most out of life. Today's guest, Jungian analyst James Hollis, teaches us how to find meaning in our second half of life. Have pen and paper ready. At the end of the program, we'll give you a list of resources on this topic. James Hollis's office appears to be that of an artist.
Art is a reflection of the soul. These are images that arise from the soul, from the human psyche. It's like our ego doesn't make them up. They wish to come through us into the world. So the artist is a perfect example of the creative process for all of us.
Instead, this is the office of a psychologist, one of the top Jungian analysts in the nation.
Jung was one of the founders of modern depth psychology, and by depth psychology we mean working with the unconscious. And so depth psychology is an effort to facilitate the relationship between the conscious world and the unconscious world so that we are not at odds with ourselves, and to produce a dialogue. It is deepening your conversation with the meaning of your own journey.
Hollis became interested in Carl Jung during his mid-years, when everything in his life appeared to be perfect.
At age 35, even though I had achieved all my goals and was surrounded by a loving family, I found myself in a very difficult depression that didn't yield to the normal assumptions that one could will one's way through it. And so I had my first hour of therapy. My psyche obviously was calling for much, much more.
Eventually, Hollis left his life as a humanities university professor, attended the Jungian Institute in Zurich, got remarried, and began to find the answers his psyche or soul was looking for.
And, soul has to do with that part of our lives which is in search of meaning and is seeking to enlarge itself in the world, not again from an ego standpoint, but in terms of the sense of meaning and purpose and direction and what really matters in life.
A search for meaning Hollis began as a child. An intellectual at heart, he taught himself to read before entering school. His father a factory worker and his mother a secretary, he was the first ever in his family to go to college.
It was sort of like traveling to Mars. People knew that it existed, but no one had been there, and no one had been able to come back and tell us how to get there. So it was a big break, I think, from the family tradition.
Today, Hollis directs the Jung Center. He's one of the most published living Jungians with 11 books to his name. One of his favorite subjects, something that marked his own life, the middle passage.
I began to realize once I was an analyst that no matter how different people's stories were, underneath there was a similar dynamic. Their ego was failing to achieve whatever they needed to achieve in their life, and yet from below there were often symptoms emerging, sometimes in their marriages, sometimes in their bodies, sometimes in their emotional life, sometimes in turbulent dreams, sometimes in addictions.
Hollis spends most of his time writing, teaching, and counseling. And as executive director of the Jung Center, which today celebrated Jung's 130th birthday, he wants to see the center grow.
Go back to your 35th birthday, and you're hit with a midlife depression, or you're having enormous marital conflict. We are now teaching about 700 students per semester in our classes here. We have an extensive outreach program, and our hope is to expand all of these activities to become less of a well-kept secret. And the issues that we're trying to address here, I think, are germane to all people. How do you live your life more consciously? What really matters? What are the issues that your life brings you to look at? With another authority figure.
Dr. James Hollis, thank you so much for joining us in Living Smart.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm going to ask you an impossible question, I know.
All right.
How to sum up Jungian psychology in a nutshell to sort of lead to how it relates to the middle passage that what we hear about in the story?
Well, I think we're all creatures of adaptation, and we probably all learned overmuch the early message of adapt to the world, whatever its messages are, and internalize those agendas. And if they happen to work out for us, we're lucky. But in most cases, I think all of us know they don't always serve our best interests. And so the insurgency that seems to come from below, that will show up in discord in relationship or symptoms in the body or troubling dreams or depression, whatever, are to be taken very seriously as a kind of corrective that the human psyche is already beginning to engage us in a dialogue whether we pay attention or not. And so if we pay attention, then I think what we do is begin a kind of deepened conversation with the meaning of the rest of our journey.
Now, I've read some of your books, and you mentioned examples of different people who go through midlife, and they're trying to find their authentic self, which might mean divorce, it might mean separation, it might mean they move to another country, it might mean that they start a new career. It's a big, drastic change sometimes. Isn't there a balance, though, that you have to reach when you are, by your actions or by you changing, you may be affecting those you love or those around you? How do you find that balance when you're trying to find your authentic self, and that may mean getting rid of these people that you have around you?
That's a deep dilemma, and I think that has been the source of great suffering for many people, including myself. And yet consider the possibility that you don't try to recover the life you're supposed to be living, and you're not living in an authentic way with your children and with your family and with your friends. How well does that serve them? You know, Jung said once the greatest burden the child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. And I think what he meant by that was not only the outer example of what we're supposed to emulate, but more importantly, where was the parent stuck? Where did the parent, in a sense, abrogate that invitation to a larger life? And because that gets internalized by the child. So there's a paradox here. While trying always to bring no harm to others, we also have to live our own life as fully as possible. And that's not selfish. That's bringing a gift to others. It's bringing a more achieved personhood into relationship.
You talk about parents, and it seems to me that you mentioned how important parents are in our lives, even though we may not think so. We may think, oh, I've broken away, I'm an adult now, but yet they seem to have a tremendous influence in our lives. How do we find out what type of influence, if it's positive or negative, in our midlife?
Well, if you ask yourself the question, in what way did I internalize my parents' lives as a message and their overt behaviors and their messages to me? And what did I internalize about permission to be who I am? Because, you know, how many of us really have permission to be who we are? I think for most of us it became sort of conditional. You are approved, you're loved, you're accepted, you're rewarded if you meet these expectations, you meet these standards. And so many times these things are playing out unconsciously, and a person doesn't literally realize that he or she's in service to those sort of parental imagos, what we call complexes, really. Mm-hmm. And we all have complexes. It's not a negative word. It simply means history has been internalized, and it's charged with energy, and it has a certain autonomy, and it plays out in our life. It makes choices for us. Right. In fact, I even wonder, in the course of any day, how many of our choices are truly free and truly conscious. And of course, until we begin to hit some walls, we have some suffering, some symptoms, some problems in our life, why would we question these things? It's a paradox that it's only when we begin to experience difficulty or suffering that we might begin to question, is it possible that my life is being lived in a way that's not right for me?
Right, right. One of the things you mentioned in your book is that midlife is when you discover the limitation of relationships. Can you explain that?
Well, I think, we're all recovering children, and so as such, we're always looking to another person at some very deep level to sort of protect us, take care of us for ourselves, meet our needs, and so forth. And as understandable as that is, ultimately, that's infantilizing. It ultimately burdens a relationship. And so one of the first symptoms of midlife discord, I think, is when one feels a problem around the relationship. Why is the other person not what I wish them to be, you see? And as the other person's probably thinking the same of us. And so that's when one begins to realize, well, I've made a projection onto that person. And none of us projects consciously. Projection's an unconscious mechanism whereby we internalize, first of all, a sense of who we are and what the other person's supposed to be, and then we transfer it to them. And then we're disappointed because they're not playing the role they're supposed to play.
So, for example, a projection would be, I'm getting married, therefore he's going to fulfill me. He's going to complete me.
Exactly.
He's going to make my life meaningful. And those projections are shattered at midlife.
Well, ultimately, because the other person in the end is like us, only a finite
They
human
want
being.
the same thing from us, but they can't get it.
They can't get it.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's asking for too much,
It's
right?
asking
the
for too
expectation's
much.
too high?
It's asking for too much, number one. And I think, number two, it can be a flight from responsibility for owning our own journey. A flight from taking responsibility for meaning in my own life. And one of the most loving and ethical things I can do for the people I profess to love is to lift my agenda off of them and allow them to be who they are.
Right. Spiritual growth.
Well, spiritual growth is part of it, certainly.
Right. Why do you think so many people have affairs during midlife?
I think, again, the reason for that is because, again, all that is unaddressed in the relationship and perhaps legitimately there in our lives and our needs and our personalities and so forth will have a tendency, again, to leave us and go out to the unknown other. And that's, again, a projection. And so many times these relationships are so transitory and so damaging. And at the same time, they occur with a high frequency. And it's not because people are bad people. It's because they are in the grip of something very powerful in their unconscious, which is one of the reasons why depth psychology tries to address what is in the unconscious. Right. And yet, by definition, we don't know what's in the unconscious until it happens out there. Or perhaps we're able to start reading the body or reading our dreams to get some kind of indication of, well, what is going on inside there.
So let's talk about dreams, because that's a very much a component of Jungian psychology. Jungian psychology studies dreams. Why is that? Is it to study the unconscious? What do dreams tell us?
Well, we all dream about 6 times a night on an average, and that's a lot of activity, and nature doesn't waste its energy. There's a purpose for that. And if we pay attention, we realize that I, the conscious me, the sense of who I am consciously, is not making those dreams up. They're coming from some other place within me, a deeper place that has a perspective that's transcendent to ordinary consciousness. It is autonomous. I can't order up a certain dream. It comes to me as a gift. And if I pay attention to it, and over time I began to realize, well, there's some part of my psychological reality that has a view of my life. It's invested. It has a wisdom to it. It may be troubling to what I consciously want, but on the other hand, what happens if I pay no attention to that? Jung said once there's a 2-million-year-old person inside of each of us, a wise guru. And if we could consult that figure from time to time, wouldn't that make sense? What if I forswear that? What if I pay no attention to that source of insight? Then I'm living strictly out of my conscious life, which is a very thin wafer floating on a very large sea.
Okay. Back to the middle passage. Does everyone go through the middle passage, or can you be born into your authentic self and know what you really want to do with your life and know who you are without suffering?
I think in some cases some individuals are able to find enough support and affirmation and freedom in their life to be able to respond to what is instinctually trying to be expressed through them, and they're very blessed indeed. I tend not to meet many of those individuals. More often I meet individuals who are experiencing conflict, which they can't get away, whether it's in the outer world or an internal conflict. And rather than try to suppress that conflict, I would say rather, let's ask what it is meaning. What is it asking of us? What is it calling attention to? Again, that's the beginning of a dialogue with the whole second half of life. And you see, in my view, and I'm deliberately overstating this, so much of the first half of life is a kind of mistake because we're sort of living reactively and responsive to the expectations of the world around us. In the second half of life, it's all about trying to get back who you really are, recover a sense of personal authenticity and personal journey. And there are lots of clues there, again, in the body, in our emotional life, in our dreams, in our behavioral patterns. And at the same time, often rather difficult choices, painful choices.
How do you process that? I mean, what are you supposed to do? Let's say you find out you're going through something like this. All of a sudden, you wake up one day, your husband says, I don't love you anymore, goodbye. And how do you deal with something like that? That's part of the middle passage. He's going through what he's going through. Mm-hmm. You have to deal with it.
Well, first of all, I think you have to hurt. And that hurting is honest and authentic. And then you have to ask yourself if, in fact, this relationship is not allowing both of us to grow, if it's not serving as a kind of platform for enabling who we really are to come into this world, then either it has to be changed radically or perhaps discarded. Not lightly, not at all. But one has to say many times the choices of the first half of life are governed by those complexes, are governed by those old parental imagos and by cultural imperatives as well. And so the question is, what is it life is asking of me, really? What is life wanting me to be in this world? And that sounds kind of simplistic, but it's an extremely complicated question. And I do believe that we spend the rest of our life trying to sort through that, because that's an ongoing and evolving answer.
You talk about inner guidance system, mm-hmm. that we all have one. Mm-hmm. But how do you find out? I mean, women tend to have more of an inner voice. Mm-hmm. They tend to be more intuitive. That's not always the case. Mm-hmm. But how do you find that inner voice? How do you find your authentic self?
Well, I think we should maybe ask the question, how is it that we lost contact with it? Because I think we have it as children. And again, the answer tracks back to the necessity of adaptation to whatever the world is asking of us. And again, particularly the family of origin has a huge role in whether it empowers the child to say, look, who you are is terrific. Don't hurt anybody if you can help it in life, but you're here to live your life and pay attention to what wants to be expressed through you. What a wonderful freedom that is. What a wonderful affirmation. And again, I find very few people who had that kind of affirmation in their childhood, and how they have to try to recover that in the second half of life. The right to be who I am without apology, with all due respect to the opinions of others, of course. This is not narcissism. It's actually paradoxically a kind of service that consciousness can make to the larger self, which is ultimately who we are, and again, what we are meant to bring into this world.
What is the difference between narcissism, let's say, and trying to find your authentic self?
Well, narcissism is a kind of self-absorption that's in service to the avoidance of conflict, search for pleasure, often at the expense of others, of course. What Jung called individuation is anything but narcissistic. It's actually, as I mentioned, a form of service. It's in a sense, asking me to relinquish my own ego needs for comfort, approval of others, for perhaps in order to make the choices I need to make for myself. I mean, most of the people that we revere in history are not people who had an easy life. Most of them are people who went through experiences of suffering and were true to something that was trying to come through in them, and as a result of which, we value them today because of their fidelity to what was seeking to be expressed in their lives.
Can you give me an example?
Well, I think of all the great religious figures. For example, in our own time, the one figure that I would look at in the contemporary world with great admiration is Nelson Mandela. Because I don't think I could have been capable of having the best years of my life taken away from me and being imprisoned unjustly and not emerging either being crushed by that or fueled with a desire for revenge. And for a person to stick to a kind of transcendent vision about what was best for his people and for everyone, I find magnificent.
What are some of the things that we should be doing in midlife? It sounds like a time of discovery, of self-discovery.
Yes, the most important thing I think we need to recognize is that our whole culture is bent on avoidance of conflict, of suffering, and the removal of our symptoms as quickly as possible. I want this problem to go away. You know, we have a short attention span and very little patience. But you're right, it's an invitation to say, so what's going on here? Who am I apart from the roles I play? Many of those roles are very important, such as parenting, for example, very rich and valuable. But who am I apart from that? Because if I'm not paying attention to that, I'm not being a good model for my children, on the one hand. And secondly, what happens when they depart? Or who am I apart from my work? Who am I apart from my relationships, my marriage? As important as marriage is, I have to have a relationship to myself because that's what I'm sharing with everyone else in all these other arenas. It's that which will either further the development and growth of our mutual journeys together or impede them.
Who should be your constant companion in midlife?
Well, we're the only ones who are present in every scene of that long-running soap opera we call our life. So we have to say, somewhere, if I'm going to be blaming the world or someone else, I have to say, somewhere I play a role in this. And, again, the one constancy in all of these separate scenes is moi. And so I have to say, and so just who are you? And what have you brought to this? Now, that takes a certain amount of courage. It sounds simple as I describe it, but it typically involves the capacity for self-scrutiny, for examining our shortcomings, our narcissistic agendas, our failings, potentially a capacity to forgive ourselves, and a capacity to take responsibility, which again sounds easy, but growing up means I am responsible for my life. And many times people are dumping that on their children, dumping that on their spouse, and it's a refusal to grow up.
How do we become in midlife more intimate, I guess, with ourselves and with others? Because that is one of the goals, isn't it?
Of course. We'd have to say, what does it mean to be intimate? And I think it means to risk being who you are, even in the face of potential rejection. Now, as children, we tried that, and we often experienced rejection of peers or of parents or of someone else. So, again, it may sound simple. It requires a certain risk, a certain boldness, a certain courage. Jung said once the spirit of evil is the domination by life by fear. And without being too reductionistic, I'd have to say, if we examine the places where we're fear-bound or driven by fear or blocked by fear, those are the places of growth. Those are the places of the agenda. That's where one has to say, what I'm afraid of is keeping me from my life. And it means being willing to push back when fear pushes us.
So you have said in midlife you should make fears your agenda.
Yes.
What exactly does that mean? Fear
Well,
being who you are?
Fear who you are, fear of risking
Failing.
your talent, fear of failure, fear of exposure, fear of ridicule. All the things that were present in most of our childhoods are still with us and are profoundly intimidating. And again, I think growing up is to say, all right, perhaps I need to be more afraid of not having been here than whatever's blocking me from taking the steps I need to take in my life.
Dr. Hollis, how do you know you're living smart?
I don't. That has to be a kind of conversation that goes on every day. And to pay attention to the correctives. And on the days I remember to pay attention, things go better. On the days I don't remember, things don't go so well.
What is the most important question, do you think, we should ask ourselves before we die that we may not ever think of asking ourselves?
Well, that's a good question in itself. I think sometimes asking the right questions is far more important than having answers. And to ask that question is really to open yourself up to the mystery of why you're here. And too often, I think all of us forget that we are part of an unfolding mystery. We ooh and ah at a baby, and partly because we understand there's mystery there, there's beginning, there's potentiality, and we forget that that's still within each of us. And so to ask that question, I believe the answer will probably be changing as we mature and as we develop. And who I am today, or who I think I am today, is far different than I would have thought a number of years ago. And so to ask that question is really to open up the question, why am I here? What life is wanting to be expressed through me? Because in the end, it becomes so clear to me that it's not about ego development or ego aggrandizement. It's about what is this ego consciousness meant to serve? What values are to be affirmed through this life? And I think it's at that point we sort of back our way into our true spirituality. You know, that our spirituality can come out for some people through the work of their hands, for some people it will come out through relationships, for some people it will come out in their work with others. It's going to vary from each of us. There's no single pattern that fits all of us, thank goodness.
It'd be a real boring world. Thank
Indeed.
you so much, Dr. Hollis, for joining us. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And for more information, you can call the Houston Jung Center at Houston at 713-524-8253 or check their website at cgjunghouston.org. You can also learn more about Jungian psychology at psychology.org. Please remember to visit houstonpbs.org/livingsmart for a complete resource list, and feel free to share your own experience on finding meaning in your second half of life. We'll post some of your emails on our website. You can call us at 713-743-8513 or email us with your comments at livingsmart@houstonpbs.org. I'm Patricia Gras. Thank you for joining us. Tune in our next episode with family therapist Nan Hall-Linke, who will discuss tips on better communication skills with the opposite sex and anyone you're having trouble with. Have a great week, and remember to live smart.